The sun hung low over the frontier town, spilling gold across the weather-beaten clapboards and filling the air with the restless heat of late afternoon. Dust swirled lazily in the street, stirred by the hooves of tethered horses stamping at flies. The church bell rang with a hollow insistence, each peal carrying over the gathered crowd like a question demanding an answer. On the steps of the small chapel stood a bride in white, Clara Mayfield, her veil trembling in the faint breeze, her hands clutching a bouquet of wilting wildflowers. The eyes of the town were fixed upon her, curious, pitying, some even mocking, as time dragged on and the man meant to stand beside her never came. Whispers cut through the silence like blades. A woman near the back murmured to her neighbor, "Ain't no groom right in. She's been left to dry." Another voice, sharper, followed, "Should have known. No man worth his salt would tie himself down that way." The words bit into Clara's ears, though she kept her gaze forward, forcing her chin high. She had been widowed young, had buried a man she once believed would give her forever, and in desperation she had answered an advertisement for a husband. Security, stability, a home, that was what she'd been promised. Now all she could feel was the sting of humiliation, the raw wound of being unwanted twice over. Her heart pounded. She fought the urge to flee, though every muscle screamed for escape. If she bolted now, she would prove them right, that she was weak, discarded, pitiful. She stood as still as the statue of a saint, while behind her the preacher shifted awkwardly, his Bible heavy in his hand, his lips pursed in silence. Minutes bled into each other. The onlookers began to drift away, some shaking their heads, others chuckled with a cruelty that came easily in a town starved for entertainment. Clara's throat tightened, her vision blurred beneath the veil. She wondered if this was how her life would always be, one long chain of waiting for someone who never came. She let the flowers fall from her hand, petals scattering across the dusty steps. And then, clear as birdsong, came a small voice. "Don't cry, miss." Clara froze. She glanced down and found a little girl no taller than her hip, staring up with solemn blue eyes that seemed far older than her years. The child's hair was sun-bleached, her dress patched in too many places to count. With the certainty of one who knew no fear, the girl tugged at Clara's gown and whispered, "I picked you for my daddy." The world seemed to tilt. Clara blinked, certain she had misheard. The crowd, what remained of it, erupted in laughter and jeers. A grizzled man slapped his knee, roaring, "Well, looks like the kid's a better matchmaker than the preacher." Another hollered, "Careful, girl. Don't saddle her with your old man." The teasing only deepened Clara's bewilderment. The little girl's grip tightened on her skirt. Her expression carried none of the mischief of a prank, but the earnestness of a plea. Clara knelt, torn between confusion and the instinct to comfort. "Sweetheart," she murmured, her voice unsteady. "What do you mean?" Before the child could answer, a shadow fell across them. Clara felt it before she saw it. A weight in the air, a silence rolling over the laughter like a storm cloud blotting the sun. She turned her head, and there, leaning against the hitching post at the edge of the street, stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn leather that had seen more dust than polish. He looked every inch the drifter mothers warned their children about. His hat shaded most of his face, but the rough jaw, the scar tracing his cheek, and the dangerous stillness in his stance marked him unmistakably. She knew that name, as anyone in the territory did. Luke McGraw, gunslinger, survivor of too many shootouts, a man carrying more enemies than friends. The townsfolk quieted, their laughter thinning into nervous mutters. Clara's breath hitched. What possible tie could there be between this child and that man? Luke pushed off the post with the slow certainty of someone who feared nothing. His boots struck the earth in measured steps, each one louder than the last. He came to a halt at the base of the church steps, his gaze not on Clara, but on the little girl clinging to her gown. "She telling the truth?" he asked, voice low, gravel ground down iron. The child nodded fiercely, her small chin jutting forward. She didn't let go. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the intensity in his eyes froze the words in her throat. Luke glanced up at her then, his gaze sharp, unreadable. For a breathless moment, Clara felt as though he was stripping away her defenses, seeing the loneliness she tried so hard to bury. His lip curled into something that might have been a smirk, though it carried no humor. "If she's picking me for her daddy," he drawled, voice carrying across the square, "then I reckon I'll be claiming the bride after all." The word struck like a bullet. The crowd gasped, some in outrage, others in awe. The preacher shifted, half ready to protest, half too afraid. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. This was no salvation she had prayed for. This was something else entirely, something dangerous, unpredictable, alive. The little girl pressed closer to her, whispering with quiet certainty, "Don't be afraid. He won't let anyone hurt you." Clara's knees weakened. For the first time since the bell tolled, she let herself truly feel, not just fear and shame, but a fragile, flickering thread of possibility. And yet, beneath it all, the air was charged with a tension that promised nothing would ever be simple again. The square rippled with unease as Luke's claim hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. No one dared laugh now. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with jaw set in stone, stepped forward, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver more from habit than intent. "McGraw," he said evenly, "this town don't take kindly to surprises. You think you can walk in here and take what ain't rightly yours." Luke's gaze didn't waver. He stood with the ease of a man who had stared down death too many times to be rattled by authority. "I didn't take nothing," he said, his voice as dry as the desert wind. "She was picked." His hand dropped briefly to rest on the girl's shoulder. She leaned into it, unconcerned with the stares boring into her small frame. "Child says she wanted a mama. Far as I see, that makes it her right to choose." Murmurs surged through the crowd, disbelief mixing with curiosity. Clara could feel their eyes drilling into her, weighing her, judging. Heat rose to her cheeks beneath the veil. She wanted to protest, to insist this was absurd. Yet when she glanced down at the child still clutching her gown, words deserted her. The girl's trust was unshakable, and against her better sense, Clara found herself unwilling to shatter it. The sheriff let the silence stretch, then huffed a sigh through his nose. "You're treading thin ice, Luke. Your past ain't exactly clean." Luke's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Show me a soul in this town whose past is." The remark cut sharper than steel. The crowd bristled, some muttering curses under their breath, but none stepped forward to challenge him. His reputation loomed larger than any bullet in their chambers. Clara's throat tightened as the sheriff stepped back, conceding ground with a look that was more warning than surrender. She felt the walls of her future closing in, not of her own making. Still, she forced herself to straighten, to draw a breath deep enough to hold back the tremor in her chest. Later, at the boarding house, the three of them sat around a table scarred with years of knife gouges and spilled whiskey. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Luke ate with the unself-conscious hunger of a man who lived from day to day, tearing at the bread like it owed him a debt. Clara sat stiff-backed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching him with wary eyes. She had seen violence in the eyes of men before, but with him there was something else, an echo of grief, perhaps, or the shadow of a burden carried too long. The girl, Emily, broke the silence first. "Pa, you're making a mess," she said, her tiny nose wrinkled at the crumbs scattering over the table. Her voice carried such frank scolding that Clara couldn't stop the faintest flicker of a smile from tugging at her lips. Luke snorted, not looking up. Been told worse. Clara studied him, torn between suspicion and a strange, reluctant amusement. The roughness of him was obvious, yet the tenderness in the way Emily nestled close to his side could not be faked. "Why me?" Clara asked finally, her voice low but steady. Luke's eyes lifted to hers, and for a long moment he didn't answer. When he did, the words were blunt. "Because she chose." I don't argue with her choices. It wasn't the answer Clara wanted, nor the one she feared. But it was an answer that revealed something more than pride. It revealed loyalty. His life may have been soaked in blood, but for the child beside him, he would strip himself bare. The meal ended with little ceremony. As they stepped out into the night air, Clara caught fragments of whispers from townsfolk lingering outside the saloon. "She's doomed." "Poor girl," tethered McGraw. Reckoned she'd be gone inside a week. The word stung, but she held her head high. Whatever her fate, she would not let them see her falter. Later that evening, Emily tugged Clara's hand, leading her down the street away from the boarding house lanterns. "Want to show you something," the child said, her voice eager. They came to a small, worn saddlebag hidden behind a livery stable. Inside lay a handful of keepsakes, a ribbon, a faded photograph, a tiny doll missing an arm. Emily touched the photograph reverently. "That was Mama," she whispered. "She got sick. Pa buried her near the river." Her eyes lifted, wide and unblinking. "He don't smile no more. But he's good, I swear. Just don't know how to show it." Clara's chest ached at the words. She realized then that this wasn't a ploy or a trick. The child had chosen her not out of whimsy, but from a deep, aching need for family, for warmth that the world had denied her too soon. By the time they returned, the street had darkened. A chill rode the wind, carrying with it the sound of horses snorting and boots crunching gravel. A group of riders stood gathered at the edge of town, their shadows stretched long by the lamplight. They didn't enter, not yet, but their presence was unmistakable. Men rougher than the dust they rode on. Their leader, tall and mean-eyed, leaned in his saddle and watched the boarding house with predatory patience. Luke stepped out onto the porch, his hand brushing the holster at his hip, as though he could feel the weight of old grudges pressing against him. The men didn't move, didn't speak, but the message was clear as a thunderhead on the horizon. Clara, standing just behind him, felt the knot of fear tighten in her belly. She had thought humiliation the worst fate. Now she understood how quickly despair could give way to danger. Emily clung to her skirts, oblivious of menace but sensing the tension. Luke's shoulders squared, his silhouette framed in the lamplight, every line of him carved with defiance. "Looks like old ghost come Callan," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Then, with a grim smile that carried no joy, he added, "Reckon they'll be wanting what's mine." Clara's heart hammered as the riders turned their horses slowly, retreating into the darkness, but not gone, never gone. The warning had been given. Trouble was coming, and in that instant, she realized a choice had already been made for her. She was bound to this man and his child, whether she willed it or not. Yet in the echo of her own fear stirred something dangerous, something she had not felt in years, an ember of courage, waiting to catch flame. The riders did not return the next day, nor the day after, but their absence felt heavier than their presence. Clara sensed the danger coiled in the silence, like a rattler hidden in tall grass. Luke went about his business with unhurried precision, repairing the sagging fence line of a rented patch of land, sharpening tools, cleaning his revolver until steel gleamed under the sun. Clara noticed how his eyes scanned the horizon as though he expected bullets to ride in on the wind. His calm unsettled her more than panic ever could. She tried to fill the hours with tasks of her own, cooking meals, stitching torn clothing, tending to Emily's ceaseless chatter. Yet beneath each chore lay a current of tension, unspoken but undeniable. She caught herself glancing at Luke more often, reading the set of his jaw, the way his hand never strayed far from his holster. For a man branded an outlaw, he carried himself not with recklessness, but with a grim kind of discipline, a soldier resigned to the next battle. Clara's resentment at being tethered to him had begun to shift. He was dangerous, yes, but danger was only one face of him. At night, when Emily curled into his side and slept without fear, Clara glimpsed another, a guardian, weathered by grief but not broken. That duality unsettled her heart. She had sought to protect her through the safe path of a promised husband. Instead, fate had set her at the side of a man who was both shield and sword, uncertain which she needed more. One afternoon, as the wind carried the smell of rain, Luke placed a rifle in her hands. "Best you know how to use it," he said simply. The wood felt alien against her palms. Clara stiffened. "I am no fighter." "You're alive," he replied. "That's all it takes." His lessons were sparse in words, but sharp in purpose. He corrected her stance, adjusted her grip, forced her to fire again and again until her shoulder ached from recoil. Emily clapped with delight at every shot that found its mark, though Clara's arms shook. By sundown, she felt something new burning in her chest. Not pride exactly, but the first embers of readiness. That night, over a modest supper, Emily leaned across the table, her cheeks flushed from laughter. "Mama shotgun clean off the post," she declared, grinning as though it were the grandest achievement in the world. Clara froze at the word. "Mama," it slipped so easily from the child's lips, without hesitation or question. She glanced at Luke, but he didn't correct Emily. Instead, his gaze lingered on Clara for a heartbeat, unreadable, then dropped back to his plate. Her heart twisted at the silence, for it felt like an acknowledgment as binding as any vow. The storm broke days later. It began with the distant thunder of hooves at dusk, a sound Clara had come to dread in her bones. Luke stiffened on the porch, rifle already in hand. Shadows crested the ridge, multiplying into a pack of riders fanning toward their homestead. The men who had watched from the edge of town now came with purpose, rifles glinting, voices rising in jeers that carried on the wind. Luke barked for Clara and Emily to get inside, his tone sharp, decisive. Clara obeyed, though her pulse hammered so loud she thought it might shatter her ribs. Through the crack of the shutter, she watched the gang circle the property, torches flaring against the dark. Their leader, the mean-eyed man she had glimpsed before, called out in a drawl dripping with malice. "McGraw, heard you took yourself a bride. Shame if your new family met the same end as the old." Clara saw Luke's shoulders tighten, his hand steady on the rifle, though his knuckles whitened. His past was no rumor. It had teeth, and they had come to bite. The attack began with fire. A torch sailed through the night, smashing against the barn, flames racing up dry timbers with a roar. Gunfire followed, cracking the air into splinters. Luke answered with lethal precision, each shot echoing like thunder, each body that fell proof of his unerring aim. Clara dragged Emily beneath the table, shielding her with trembling arms as bullets tore holes in the walls. Fear clawed at her throat, but something else surged alongside it, a refusal to cower. When Luke shouted for ammunition, Clara crawled to the chest, fumbling with shaking hands to reload. When the back door splintered and a rider charged inside, she snatched the rifle Luke had given her. The man's eyes widened at the sight of a bride in white clutching steel. Her shot rang true, knocking him backward into the dirt. Her ears rang, her breath came ragged, but a fierce clarity gripped her. She was no longer merely surviving humiliation. She was fighting for a life she might yet claim. The battle raged until smoke choked the air and bodies littered the yard. Luke fought like a man with nothing left to lose, and Clara realized he fought not for himself, but for the child who cried against her skirts, for the woman who had been thrust unwilling into his world. His rage was not blind. It was anchored, channeled, sharpened by purpose. When the dust settled, only a handful of riders remained. Their leader advanced through the smoke, his grin feral, pistol glinting in the firelight. Luke staggered, blood darkening his shirt, but he raised his revolver all the same. The man sneered, his voice a viper's hiss. "You'll die alone, McGraw," just like before. Luke's jaw clenched. His voice was hoarse, but it carried with it the weight of defiance. Not this time. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle, stepping forward out of the shadows, her breath steady, her heart unyielding. The moment stretched thin as glass, ready to shatter. The storm was not yet over, but in that suspended silence, Clara knew one truth with absolute clarity. She was no longer the abandoned bride. Whatever came next, she would face it beside them. The smoke thinned, curling skyward in fading ribbons as the last echoes of gunfire slipped into silence. The yard was a graveyard of spent shells and still bodies, the barn smoldering like a pyre. Clara's arms ached from the weight of the rifle, her chest heaving, yet her stance remained firm. Luke swayed on his feet, blood running down his arm, his revolver loose in his grasp. Across from him stood the leader of the raiders, hatred etched into every line of his face, a pistol cocked and ready. Clara stepped forward, her veil torn, her dress scorched at the hem, but her eyes unwavering. The man's sneer faltered as he registered her resolve. She raised her rifle, her breath steady, and fired. The shot cracked through the night, striking true. The leader staggered, shock flashing across his features before he crumpled into the dirt. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the surviving raiders, stripped of their venom, spurred their horses and fled into the darkness, their silhouettes swallowed by the hills. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of dying flames. Clara lowered the rifle slowly, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Luke dropped to one knee, clutching his wound. She rushed to his side, pressing cloth against the blood. He winced but did not push her away. For the first time, she saw his eyes without the shield of defiance. Pain lived there, but so did something deeper, gratitude, and a vulnerability he had long buried. "You should have run," he rasped. "I'm done running," she answered, her voice raw but unyielding. Emily crept from her hiding place, her face streaked with soot and tears. She threw her small arms around both of them, squeezing as if her embrace alone could mend the wounds of the night. "We're still together," she whispered, her voice fierce in its innocence. "We're still a family." Luke's breath shuddered. His hand found the back of the girl's head, holding her close. Clara felt the weight of that word. Family settle over her, fragile yet undeniable. She had not chosen this life, not in the way she imagined, yet standing there in the ashes, she knew she belonged to it now. In the days that followed, the town spoke of what had happened in hushed tones. Some called it madness, others bravery. The sheriff rode out to see the wreckage himself, and when he returned, he tipped his hat to Clara with something bordering on respect. "You've got grit," he told her, voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "And McGraw, well, maybe there's more to him than his reputation." The townsfolk, who once laughed at her humiliation on the church steps, now watched her with new eyes. They saw not an abandoned bride, but a woman who had stood her ground against men who would have burned everything to cinders. Whispers turned into nods, nods into quiet greetings. Acceptance crept in like dawn, hesitant but steady. At the ranch, rebuilding began. Luke's movements were slower, his wounds still healing, but his determination had not dimmed. Clara worked beside him, hammer in hand, sweat streaking her brow, her muscles sore but alive with purpose. Each nail driven into it felt like a stake anchoring her to this place, to this life. Emily skipped between them, her laughter cutting to the weight of labor, her small hands eager to help even when her efforts slowed the work more than sped it. One evening, as the sky bled crimson over the horizon, Clara and Luke sat on the porch steps, Emily asleep on Clara's lap. The air smelled of earth and smoke, the remnants of destruction giving way to renewal. Luke's voice broke the quiet, low and graveled. "I lost him," he said, eyes fixed on the distance. "My wife, my boy, couldn't save Em. Thought if I kept moving, kept fighting, I wouldn't have to feel it. But it never left me." Clara listened, her hand resting on Emily's hair. She felt the rawness of his confession, the cracks in the armor he wore so carefully. "I know what it is to lose," she said softly. "I buried my husband with dreams we never lived. I thought another man might give me safety, but what I needed was to find my own strength first." He turned to her then, truly looking, and in his gaze she saw the recognition of a kindred wound. The silence stretched, not empty but full of words unspoken, a tether forming between them stronger than any vow spoken at an altar. Emily stirred in her sleep, mumbling, "Mama, Pa," before slipping back into dreams. The simplicity of it broke the tension, drew a faint chuckle from Luke's lips, surprising in its warmth. Clara smiled, the sound wrapping around her like a promise. As weeks passed, life took on a rhythm. The scars of battle lingered, but so did the resilience that had carried them through. Clara found herself laughing more, not the polite laughter she had once offered society, but full, unguarded bursts that surprised her. Luke softened at the edges, his silences less heavy, his presence less haunted. He never said the words outright, but in the way he watched her, in the way his hand sometimes brushed hers without recoil, she felt the unspoken truth. They had chosen each other, not by fate's cruel joke, but by survival, by courage, by the small voice of a child who refused to accept loneliness. One Sunday, Clara walked through town with Emily's hand in hers, and Luke at her side. Heads turned, but not with mockery. Some tipped hats, others offered smiles. The preacher who once stumbled over his silence nodded in greeting. Clara felt no shame, no sting of memory from the days she had stood alone, on the chapel steps. She felt only the steady strength of belonging, of being seen not as discarded but as transformed. That evening, as stars spilled across the sky, Clara sat with Luke and Emily on the porch once more. The cicadas sang their chorus. The land stretched vast and eternal around them. Clara spoke quietly, her words more for herself than for them. Life out here breaks people, but it can build them too. Families aren't always born, they're chosen. Luke's hand covered hers, rough but steady. Emily nestled between them, sighing contentedly in her sleep. Clara let her gaze linger on the horizon, where shadows met starlight, where endings bled into beginnings. "If this story moved you," she whispered, as though to the wind itself, "don't forget to carry it with you and share it. Every voice matters, even on the frontier." The night deepened, holding them close, and for the first time since she had stood abandoned in white, Clara felt not forsaken but whole.